Um, isn't she a dynamo? uh, First, I have my credentials here as a latte liberal, so I will use my credentials regularly. Um, by trade, I'm a cognitive scientist and a linguist, and I study how the brain works and how a physical brain can give rise to thought and language. And we've discovered a huge amount in the last 30 years. And so what I want to do is start out very briefly by giving you the briefest overview of your own minds in ways that you might not be thinking about them. I was brought up with a certain view of the mind that comes from the year 1650. Think of Descartes. And this is called Enlightenment Reason. And here is the assumptions about reason that I learned growing up, and you may have learned them too. The first assumption is that you know what you think, that reason is conscious. The fact is it's 98% unconscious. 98% unconscious. Second, reason is supposed to be dispassionate. It's the opposite. You can't be rational without being emotional. What does that mean? There was a discovery made in the 90s by Antonio Damasio and his wife Hannah. And what they discovered was this. If you look at people who have strokes or brain damage that make them unable to feel emotion, there are such things, what happens? Imagine that you had such a stroke. You can't feel any emotion, and you don't know what anyone else feels, ever. Okay? Now, how would you know what to want? Like and not like don't mean anything to you, right? You don't know if what you decide to do would result in people hating you or liking you. You couldn't tell. How would you know what to want? You wouldn't. You cannot make a rational decision, and that's what happens with these folks. They screw up their lives completely. They make random decisions, and then all hell breaks loose. And you cannot think without emotion. Why? Okay, we'll get to that in a minute. Second, it's assumed that you can reason directly about the world, that reason can fit the world as it is directly. False. Why? Very simple thing. You think with your brain. You have no choice. That's all you can do is think with your brain. Your brain evolved to run a body. Well, everything you understand about anything at all comes through your body and is understood in your brain. Every idea is there in neural circuitry. Without the neural circuitry, you don't think. And we now know a lot about how neural circuitry gives rise to thought. But what does it mean? It turns out that the brain is not arbitrarily structured. It's not a general purpose computer or anything like that. It has very particular structure. And that means that you think in terms of structures called frames, for example. What is a frame? The structure of frames was discovered simultaneously about in the mid-1970s by three great scholars in three different fields. One of them was Erving Goffman, a sociologist, who studied institutions by working in them, like insane asylums, and he spent a year as a croupier in Las Vegas to study Las Vegas, right? And he came to the conclusion in a book called Frame Analysis in '74 that every institution is structured by a frame. And what is a frame? It's a set of roles that people play. Think of a hospital. There are doctors and nurses and patients and receptionists and places like operating rooms and reception desks and recovery rooms and instruments like scalpels and defibrillators and so on. Those are the elements of the hospital frame. Then there are things that happen in hospitals. That is the normal stuff. Surgeons operate on patients in operating rooms with scalpels. And you know when the frame is broken. If you walk into the hospital, going to visit somebody, you got your flowers, you go to the reception desk, there's a doctor lying there, they hand you a scalpel saying you're operating on the doctor, something is wrong. Right? You've broken the frame. Right? That isn't what happens. You know what happens in hospitals because you know the frame of that. Charles Fillmore, who's a linguist, my colleague, observed that every word is defined with respect to a frame. Think of a word like operating room or surgeon, which is defined with respect to an operation frame and requires certain kinds of tools and so on. That is, you don't have a word like surgeon without a notion of an operation, a patient, things you use to operate on, and so on. So this is important. Every word is defined with respect to such a structure, and that structure is neurally there in your brain. It is a physical thing. Okay? We think in terms of those things, and they are not neutral. They don't just fit the world as it is. Frames come in systems. And those systems are structured in terms of worldviews and moral views. We'll talk about that in a minute. Okay? We also think in terms of metaphors. Metaphors are modes of thought. They're not just in language. They have to do with the way we think. And a system of metaphors is learned, what are called primary metaphors, are learned before you learn language just by functioning in the world. So, and you learn hundreds. For example, you learn more is up and less is down. Not just here, not just in the US, not just in Europe, but around the world. Right? Why? You learn that affection is warmth. Somebody's a warm person or a cold person. Why? How does that happen? Well, here's how it works. Let's take more is up. I pour more water into a glass, the level goes up. Okay? Every time. Never misses. I pour more stuff on the desk, the level goes up. If you're a baby and you look around and this happens around you, more formula gets put in the bottle, the level goes up, etc. And you see this, you may not be paying attention, but your brain is. Your brain is activated in two ways. There's two parts of your brain activated, one for quantity and one for verticality. So every time the quantity goes up, the verticality goes up. The two parts of your brain are activated together. Now, what happens when two parts of the brain are activated together over and over and over every day? Right? You have activation. Every neuron is connected to 10,000 others. So groups of neurons that compute quantity and those that compute verticality are activated over and over together. And there are particular pathways that you're born with. So along these pathways, the activation spreads. And each time a neuron is activated, it gets stronger. The connections to the next neuron get strengthened. That is, you get more receptor molecules across the synapses. Because we can talk about why later, if you care about it. All right, now, it turns out what happens is that the activation spreads along existing pathways until they find the shortest common path. And then you got activation from both directions and you form a circuit. And it keeps on getting stronger every day. That circuit is the metaphor that more is up, less is down. And then you have language. When you learn language, you learn prices rise and prices fall and they skyrocket and all sorts of things like that. But it's a generalization that you've learned that's physically there in your brain. And you have learned hundreds of these. Okay? Hundreds. Let me give you an example of one that we just came across the other day. One of the ones that you learn is that power is pleasure. Right? If you exert force on something as a kid, hey, I did it, cool, great. You feel pleasure. And you feel pleasure in certain emotional regions, right? There are a couple of, there's a positive and negative emotional pathway. Now, then you can imagine, you can talk about power as being a drug and so on. You can talk about power in terms of,